In the year 54, in a palace in Rome, a servant named Helotus lifted a spoon to his lips before the Emperor Claudius was allowed to eat. That was his whole profession. To die first, so the most powerful man in the world would not. History says the poison came anyway, and that Helotus, the very taster meant to guard the emperor, may have been the one who slipped it in. This is the origin of the food taster, the servant hired to die who learned he could kill. So how does a man whose only duty was to swallow poison end up as one of the most feared figures in the palace? To answer that, you have to understand what this job really was, because the food taster is one of the oldest professions on Earth and one of the strangest ever invented. It rests on a single cold premise: that another person's life is worth less than yours, and that their death, if it comes, can buy you a few more seconds to push the plate away. For most of recorded history, wherever there was a crown worth killing for, there was someone standing just behind it, chewing slowly, waiting to feel the first cramp. What follows is how that person came to exist, how the same job appeared independently in nearly every empire that ever feared its own kitchen, and how it quietly survived into the world you live in now, hiding inside laboratories, security details, and a single coffee cup insured for millions. The Romans had a precise word for him: Praegustator. It comes from pre, meaning before, and gustar, meaning to taste. If that root sounds familiar, it should, because it is buried in words you use every day. When you eat something with gusto, when you find an idea distasteful, when a doctor talks about your gustatory senses, you are speaking the food taster's ancient language. Even the word disgust is, at its root, the feeling of something tasted and thrown back by the body. The profession is so old that it left its fingerprints all over the way we talk about eating. And in Rome, the Praegustator was no casual servant. He tasted every dish set before the emperor, and he did it first, always first, so that if death was hiding in the sauce, it would find him and not the man in the purple robe. But Rome did not invent the idea. It inherited it. Go back further, and you find the same fearful arithmetic in nearly every ancient court. In India, a political manual called the Arthashastra, written more than 2,000 years ago, laid out detailed instructions for keeping a king alive, and among them was the rule that his food must be tasted before he touched it, sometimes by servants, sometimes even by the cook, who was made to swallow a mouthful of what he had prepared. In the Persian and biblical courts, the trusted figure was the cupbearer, the man who poured and tasted the king's wine. The book of Nehemiah opens with its narrator serving as cupbearer to a Persian king, a post of enormous confidence precisely because that man controlled what passed the royal lips. In ancient Egypt, in China, in the halls of Assyria, the pattern repeated. Where there was absolute power, there was absolute fear of the plate, and a person hired to face it first. The fear reached just as deep in the East. In imperial China, the emperor's meals were a matter of life and death handled by a small army of kitchen officials, and every dish that traveled from the imperial kitchens to the throne was tasted along the way. The Chinese court trusted more than the human tongue, though. Servants tested the emperor's food with thin pieces of silver, a silver needle or a silver chopstick laid against the dish, in the belief that the metal would turn black if poison was present. There is even a grain of chemistry behind the superstition. The common poisons of the age were crude arsenic compounds, often contaminated with sulfur, and sulfur does tarnish silver. It did not truly detect the arsenic, but it detected something, often enough to keep the belief alive for centuries. So, the Chinese emperor ate behind two shields, a living taster, and a piece of blackening metal, and he trusted neither one completely. The Greek writer Xenophon, describing the Persian court, left us a picture of just how refined this fear could become. The royal cupbearer would draw a little of the wine into a special ladle, pour it into his cupped left hand, and sip it in full view of the king before presenting the cup, so that everyone could see the wine was clean and the server was staking his own life on it. It was a small, elegant piece of choreography repeated at every single meal, and it tells you how seriously these courts took the threat. A cup of wine was not simply poured, it was proven. Under the Roman emperors, this fear grew into something almost bureaucratic. The Praegustatores were not lone servants but an organized body, a collegium with their own supervisor, a procurator praegustatorum, managing the tasters of the imperial household. Think about what that means. The danger of being poisoned at dinner was so constant, so expected, that the palace ran an entire department devoted to it, a human early warning system with a chain of command. These men were often slaves or freedmen, and their nearness to the emperor's body gave them a strange, double-edged intimacy. They knew what he ate, when he ate, how he could be reached. And that knowledge, as one of them would prove, was worth more than gold. To understand why the taster mattered so much, you have to meet his opposite number, the professional poisoner. In Nero's Rome, there was a woman named Praegustator, a poisoner from Gaul, so skilled that the imperial family kept her the way a modern state keeps a weapons expert. The historians say Agrippina used her to help murder Claudius, and that Nero then employed her to poison his own rival, the young Britannicus, at a dinner table in front of the whole court. The story goes that Britannicus had a taster, so the poison was worked around him. The boy was served a harmless drink that was deliberately too hot, and when he asked for it to be cooled, cold water carrying the poison was added after the tasting was already done. Read that again. The killers did not defeat the food taster by overpowering him. They defeated him by understanding exactly how the ritual worked and slipping the poison into the one gap the ritual left open. For every taster, somewhere, there was a locusta studying the routine. Which brings us back to Helotus. He was a eunuch in the service of the Emperor Claudius, and his official role was Praegustator, the taster. In the year 54, Claudius died after eating a dish of mushrooms, a delicacy he was known to love. The ancient historians Tacitus and Suetonius tell the story, and though the details differ and are almost certainly embellished, the shape is always the same. The emperor was poisoned, and the poison came through his food. Suspicion fell on his wife Agrippina, who wanted her son Nero on the throne, and on the people closest to the plate, the physician and the taster. Here is the detail everyone forgets. Helotus, the man whose entire purpose was to protect the emperor from poison, not only survived the event but kept his position and prospered. Years later, the Emperor Galba, far from punishing him, is said to have granted him a lucrative office. The taster hired to die had somehow become untouchable. Some rulers refused to trust anyone else's mouth and tried to become their own antidote. The most famous was Mithridates VI, king of Pontus in the 1st century before Christ, who was so afraid of being poisoned that he reportedly dosed himself daily with tiny amounts of poison to build up a resistance. The practice was named after him, Mithridatism, and the legend says it worked too well. When he was finally defeated and tried to kill himself with poison, it would not take, and he had to ask a soldier to run him through with a sword. Whether or not the tale is exaggerated, it shows the same obsession from the other side. A king could hire a taster to face the poison for him, or he could try to turn his own body into the taster. Either way, the dinner table was a battlefield. The job outlived Rome and passed to the empires that followed. In the Byzantine palaces of Constantinople, tasters guarded emperors who were poisoned so often that the fear had its own settled place in court politics. Centuries later, in the Ottoman Empire, the sultans of Topkapi Palace ran one of the most elaborate kitchens in the world, feeding thousands every day, and the food destined for the sultan passed through trusted officials who tasted it before it could cross the threshold of his private chambers. The dishes were sealed and carried under guard, and a taster stood at the final door. The grander the empire, the longer the journey from kitchen to throne, and the more mouths that food had to survive along the way. Every one of those mouths belonged to someone whose life had been quietly wagered against the rulers. The job did not die with Rome. It marched straight into the medieval and Renaissance courts of Europe, and it brought a new ritual, and, with it, another buried word. At a great lord's table, before the food reached him, servants performed what was called the assay, a formal tasting to prove the dishes were safe. In the Italian courts, this act of tasting for trust was carried out at a side table, and the tasting itself was called the credenza, from the Latin credere, to believe or to trust. Read that again. Because the piece of furniture in modern dining rooms called a credenza, that low sideboard where you keep your plates, is named after the moment a servant tasted a duke's food to prove it would not kill him. Every time someone admires their credenza, they are admiring a monument to poison. The furniture kept the name long after everyone forgot the fear that gave it one. The medieval courts added another layer to the ritual, one that mixed the practical with the magical. Alongside the human taster, a great lord might keep objects believed to reveal or neutralize poison. A bezoar, a hard mass taken from the stomach of a goat, thought to make a poisoned drink safe. Or a piece of so-called unicorn horn, usually the tusk of a narwhal sold at staggering prices, which was supposed to sweat or change color in the presence of venom. Cups were carved from rare stones for the same reason. None of it worked, of course, but it sat on the table beside the living taster, a whole industry of fear built around the single question of whether the next bite could kill you. By the Renaissance, poison had become almost an art form, and nowhere more than in Italy. The Borgia family, and especially Cesare Borgia and his father, Pope Alexander VI, gained a fearsome reputation, deserved or not, for removing their enemies with a white powder the legends called cantarella, most likely a form of arsenic. Whether the Borgias truly poisoned as many people as the stories claim is doubtful, but the reputation alone changed how people ate at their table. When Catherine de' Medici left Italy to become Queen of France, that reputation traveled with her, and the French court became convinced that Italian poisoners lurked behind every dish. Fear of poison shaped who was trusted, who was feared, and who was allowed to stand near the food. In that climate, the taster was not a quaint relic. He was the last line of defense in a game everyone believed was being played for keeps, and that fear was not always paranoia. In 17th century France, under Louis XIV, a genuine poisoning panic erupted that came to be called the Affair of the Poisons. Investigators uncovered a whole underground trade in arsenic, sold quietly to wives who wished to be widows and to heirs who did not want to wait until the poison earned a nickname, poudre de succession, the inheritance powder. A fortune teller and poison seller known as Lavoisin sat at the center of it. Not long before her, a noblewoman called the Marquise de Brinvilliers had been executed for poisoning her own father and brothers to seize the family fortune, and she is said to have tested her poisons first on the sick in the hospital she visited under the cover of charity. When cases like these reached the pamphlets and gossip of the day, every powerful person in Europe looked at their dinner a little differently, and the servant who tasted it first suddenly seemed like a very sound investment. In the royal households of medieval England and France, the tasting hardened into strict ceremony. It was called the assay, and it governed everything the monarch consumed. An officer would take a piece of bread, rub it against the meat or dip it into the drink, and eat it in the sovereign's sight. The cup was assayed before the king drank. The water he washed his hands in was assayed, and even the linens and the plate were checked, because a clever poisoner might coat a napkin or the rim of a goblet. Great nobles who served the king at table treated these duties as an honor, not a menial chore, precisely because they proved trust. To be allowed to taste the king's food was to be told, in front of the entire court, that the king believed you were not trying to kill him. The ritual turned a defensive necessity into a currency of status, and men competed for the privilege of eating first. And here's the hinge of the whole story. Look closely at these tasters. From Helotus in Rome, to the cupbearers of Persia, to the trusted servants of the Renaissance, and you notice something that turns the job upside down. The food taster was hired because he was expendable, a body to be spent. But the work itself, standing closer to the ruler than almost anyone alive, controlling the one thing every human being must do to survive, quietly turned him into something else entirely. The most disposable person in the palace became one of the most trusted, and therefore one of the most powerful. Proximity was the prize. The man who could be sacrificed was also the man who could, if he chose, do the killing himself. That is the terrible paradox at the center of this profession, and it is why a poison taster like Helotus could end his life not on a slab, but rewarded. So how did the job actually work, and why did anyone believe it kept the ruler safe? Honestly, it worked less well than the ritual suggested. A taster only caught poisons that acted fast, within the length of a meal, and any poisoner with patience could use a slow one that killed hours or days later, long after the taster had swallowed his sample and stepped back unharmed. Clever courts tried to close that gap by making the taster wait, sometimes a full hour, before the food was served, watching him the whole time. But everyone understood that the tasting was never a perfect shield. Its real power was psychological. It announced, in front of the entire court, that the ruler's life was guarded at every mouthful, that an assassin would have to kill a loyal servant first and hope no one noticed. The tasting was theater as much as science, a daily performance of trust and fear staged at the dinner table, and the taster was its lead actor. So what does this ancient job look like today? You might assume it vanished with kings and emperors. It did not. It went underground, and it split in two. On one side, the poison taster still exists, quietly, for the powerful. During the Second World War, Adolf Hitler kept a group of about 15 young women, whose job was to taste his food before he ate it, terrified with every bite. One of them, a woman named Margot Wolk, kept the secret until she was 95 years old, when she finally described the weeping at the table and the hour they waited to see who would collapse. She said she later learned that the other 14 women were shot at the war's end and that she alone survived to tell it. The premise Helotus lived under, that a leader's food must pass through someone else first, had walked straight into the 20th century. And it is not only the distant past or a single dictator. The leaders of North Korea have long been reported to travel with food that is inspected and tasted before it reaches them, even carrying their own supplies abroad so that nothing served by a foreign host goes untested. When a modern American president travels, his food does not simply arrive from a hotel kitchen. A military medical unit and the Secret Service oversee it, and meals are prepared under supervision and, according to numerous reports, tested in a laboratory before they are served, a quiet, scientific descendant of the Praegustator. Popes have had their meals guarded, monarchs have kept trusted kitchens, and leaders who fear assassination rely on layers of food security that any Roman emperor would recognize at a glance. The tools changed from a slave's tongue to a chemical assay, but the assumption underneath is identical. A powerful person's food must be proven safe by someone or something other than the powerful person. On the other side, the taster became something no Roman could ever have imagined, a highly paid professional whose palate is a corporate asset. The modern food and drink industry runs on expert tasters, the sensory panelists, the master blenders, the coffee and whiskey and tea tasters whose trained tongues decide what millions of people will buy. These are trained specialists paid comfortable salaries to do nothing but taste, describing flavor with a vocabulary most of us do not have, and spitting rather than swallowing, so their judgment stays sharp across dozens of samples a day. And here is the concrete example. Gennaro Polliccia, the master taster for a large British coffee company, had his tongue insured with Lloyd's of London for around £10 million because his sense of taste was the quality control for every cup the company sold. Read that again. A job that began with a slave swallowing poison to protect a king has an heir whose taste buds are valued at £10 million on an insurance policy. The food taster did not disappear. He put on a lab coat, and his tongue became the product. That commercial world has grown into something remarkable. Becoming a master sommelier, one of the hardest professional exams anywhere, can take a decade of study, and the few who pass can command real money for a palate that reliably knows one vineyard from another. Whiskey distilleries employ master blenders and nosers whose noses, not machines, sign off on what goes into the bottle. There are professional water tasters, tea tasters, and olive oil tasters, and there are flavorists who literally design the taste of the food you buy. In every one of these jobs, a human being is paid, sometimes extremely well, to put something in their mouth and deliver a verdict that a company will stake millions on. The taster's tongue is no longer a shield held up against death. It has become an instrument of quality, and in a few famous cases, an asset worth insuring for the price of a mansion. Same organ, same act, opposite purpose. So think back to Helotus, standing in that Roman dining hall lifting a spoon to his lips before Claudius could eat. We tend to picture him as a victim, a disposable body waiting for the cramp. But he understood something the emperor did not. The tasting was never really about the food. It was about who stood closest to power, who controlled the one act no ruler could avoid, and who, in the end, held the emperor's life in his own hands. The food was never the point. Trust was the product. Proximity was the price. And that is why the man hired to die outlived the man he was hired to protect. That's not an accident. That is the oldest business model at any table where power sits down to eat, control the plate, and you control the king. The next time you watch someone taste a dish before a powerful person, remember that you are looking at 4,000 years of fear, dressed up as a courtesy. If this video changed the way you look at the person standing just behind the powerful, subscribe, because next we are covering more everyday jobs whose real history nobody ever tells you.